My mother-in-law showed up at my hotel on a Tuesday night in the middle of a sold-out jazz weekend, wearing a fur coat in 70-degree Atlanta heat, with my sister-in-law and her husband right behind her, and the first words out of her mouth were not hello. They were not. I'm sorry. They were, we need the penthouse suite and we need it comped tonight. I had not spoken to any of them in 7 years. 7 years since my mother-in-law stood in the doorway of her son's childhood home in Marietta and told me, in front of my husband's entire extended family at Christmas dinner, that I was a gold digger who had latched onto her son because I came from nothing and always would. 7 years since my sister-in-law left. 7 years since her husband. This man now standing in my lobby in a three-piece suit that was a full size too small, nodded along like he was watching a sermon. My name is Vera, and I am 31 years old. I am the founder and sole owner of the Caldwell House, a boutique luxury hotel in the Old Fourth Ward neighborhood of Atlanta. We have 42 rooms, a rooftop terrace with a view of the skyline that travel bloggers have called the most underrated sunset in the American South. A small plates restaurant on the ground floor, and a partnership with two of the biggest jazz festival promoters in the city. On any given weekend, my lobby smells like fresh gardenias and Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee, and there is a waiting list for weekend reservations that runs 6 weeks out. I built it from scratch, starting at 22 years old, working the front desk at a Marriott property across town, saving every shift differential, every tip from the bellhop pool I was technically not supposed to share in. I took online courses in hotel management at night after 12-hour shifts. I lived in a studio apartment so small I had to fold my ironing board into the closet every morning just to open the refrigerator. I did that for 4 years while learning everything I could about boutique hospitality, commercial real estate, and small business financing in Georgia. I did it alone. Because after that Christmas dinner, my husband chose his family. He did not choose them loudly. He chose them the way weak people always do. Gradually, apologetically, with 100 small betrayals that each felt like a misunderstanding until you stood back and saw the whole picture. He stopped defending me in family group chats. He started going to his parents' house without telling me. He began repeating things I said in private back to his mother with just enough distortion to make me sound unstable. By the time I understood what was happening, my marriage was already a shell, and his family had won. I filed for divorce at 24. He did not contest it. His mother sent me a card, an actual greeting card with a watercolor sunflower on the front, that said, in her handwriting, "This is for the best. You were never right for this family. I hope you find your level." I kept that card. I taped it to the inside cover of my very first business plan notebook. Now I was 31, standing behind the reception desk of the hotel I had built with my own hands. And she was standing in my marble lobby demanding a free penthouse suite like she was reading from a script she had already decided would work. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment, because I think people expect the story to go straight to the triumph. They want to skip over the part where your hands go cold and your stomach drops, and for about 3 seconds you are 23 years old again, sitting at that Christmas table while someone dismantles you in front of 20 people and your husband doesn't say a word. I felt all of that. And then I felt it pass. I took one slow breath, set down the clipboard I was holding, and walked out from behind the reception desk. My front desk manager, a sharp young woman named Portia who had been with me since we opened, watched me from the corner of her eye with the particular stillness of someone who is ready to dial a number the moment I give her a look. My mother-in-law had aged. That surprised me. Not the fact of it, but how much. She had always been the kind of woman who treated her appearance like a business asset, the kind who scheduled her blowouts and her facials and her quarterly Botox with the same precision she applied to her social calendar. But standing under the warm mauve lighting of the Caldwell House, she looked smaller than I remembered. The fur coat was doing a lot of work. My sister-in-law looked exactly the same. Same sharp posture. Same practiced look of mild contempt. She aimed at anything she considered beneath her. Her husband, whose name I had genuinely spent years trying to forget and now recalled was Broderick, was scanning my lobby with the expression of a man doing mental math. None of them looked happy to be here. That told me everything I needed to know about why they were. "I don't have a reservation under your name," I said pleasantly, as if we were strangers. "Did you book through the website or a third party?" My mother-in-law blinked. She had not expected me to play it that way. She had probably expected either tears or rage, because those were the only two registers she had ever seen me operate in, and she had spent 7 years believing that was the full range of what I was capable of. Vera, she said, and the way she said my name had that particular texture. The slight pause before it, the half-swallowed quality of someone who has decided to be magnanimous. We know you own this place. We're not here as strangers. We're family. Former family, I said, still pleasantly. And regardless, we'd need a reservation. We're fully booked this weekend, Jazz Festival. But I'd be happy to check our availability for next month if you'd like to leave a contact. Behind her, Broderick cleared his throat. He stepped forward with his hands in his jacket pockets, which gave him the body language of someone who had once read a book about appearing confident. Listen, Vera, we didn't drive 2 hours from Marietta to be put on a waiting list. We know things have been strained between the family and you. But that's history. We're here because there's something we need to discuss. Something that could actually benefit everyone. Now, if you'll just get us settled in a suite, we can talk about it over dinner. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at my sister-in-law, who had drifted slightly toward the gardenias on the console table and was examining the ceramic pot they sat in the way a buyer examines something they're considering making an offer on. I'll tell you what, I said. I do have the private dining room available. Why don't we go in there and have this conversation now? No need to wait for a suite. I watched the same micro-calculation cross all three of their faces. They had prepared for resistance. They had not fully prepared for accommodation because accommodation felt like winning, and so they followed me. The private dining room at the Caldwell House is at the back of the ground floor restaurant, separated from the main floor by a pair of frosted glass pocket doors. It seats 10. It is where I host investors, where visiting artists eat before their shows, where the occasional local politician comes when they want to have a meal without being photographed. It is also soundproofed, which people who don't know this building don't think about. I seated them. I poured water. I sat down at the head of the table. My mother-in-law settled into her chair and looked around the room with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the same look she had given my apartment the one time she visited when my ex-husband and I were still together, before she had fully decided I was beneath them. It was the look of a woman recalculating how much something is worth. "This is actually quite lovely," she said, as if she was granting a pardon. "I had heard the reviews, but I thought they were, you know how these things get inflated." "What did you want to discuss?" I asked. She folded her hands on the table. "Your ex-husband." She never called him by his name in front of me, I noticed, as if naming him would make him too real, too present. "Is going through a difficult time." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. I was not particularly sorry to hear that. His company, Broderick jumped in, with the energy of a man who had been waiting for his cue, has hit a temporary liquidity issue. It's not a crisis, it's a restructuring moment. He's been in advanced conversations with some investors out of Charlotte who are very serious. We're talking term sheet conversations. But the timeline has shifted and there's a gap he needs to bridge. I said nothing. I had learned, somewhere in my late 20s, that silence in a negotiation is not emptiness, it is pressure, Broderick continued. The number we're looking at, to cover payroll and keep his core team intact while the Charlotte deal closes, is in the range of $300,000. Now, we're not asking for a gift, we're proposing a structured arrangement. He would give you a 15% equity stake in the company in exchange for the bridge financing. It's genuinely a strong deal for the right partner, and given the history, given that you were married, it feels appropriate to keep this in the family. I watched him say all of this with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed it in the car on the way here. I wondered who had driven, who had suggested stopping for gas, whether they had argued about the radio. I wondered whether my ex-husband knew they were here, or whether they had decided to handle this themselves. "How is he?" I asked, which was not the question any of them expected. My sister-in-law, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "He's managing," she said, in a tone that contained about 17 unspoken accusations about whose fault all of this was. She had my ex-husband's same eyes, their mother's eyes actually, and she used them the way their mother did, like a tool. "He would have called you himself, but it's complicated given everything. It felt easier to come in person." "Did he ask you to come in person?" "Did he ask you to come?" A pause. Half a second too long. We're family, my mother-in-law said smoothly, which was not an answer. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. The jazz trio in the main restaurant had started their second set. I could feel it more than hear it. A low, pleasant vibration through the wall. Full house out there. Every seat taken. My staff moving through it like a current. I want to ask you something, I said, setting the glass down. And I'd like an honest answer, though I understand that might be difficult. My mother-in-law's chin lifted slightly. The fur coat had come off. It was warm in the dining room. And without it, she looked less armored than she had in the lobby, though her posture still did most of the work. You drove 2 hours, I said. You didn't call, you didn't email. You walked into my hotel, which you have never set foot in before tonight, and the first thing you said was that you needed the penthouse suite comped. You followed that up with a request for $300,000, and you framed all of this as being about family. I leaned forward slightly. So, here's my question. What happened to my mother-in-law who told me at a Christmas dinner 7 years ago in front of everyone that I came from nothing and always would? The silence in the room changed quality. Broderick looked at the table. My sister-in-law looked at her mother. My mother-in-law looked at me. People say things, she started. You sent me a card, I said, after the divorce. A sunflower card. You wrote that I should find my level. I let that sit. I kept it. It's been very motivating. Something shifted in her expression. Not remorse exactly. More like the recognition that the room had changed shape and she was no longer sure of the exits. Broderick recovered first. He always struck me as the type who needed to be talking to feel like he existed. Look, Vera, we're not here to relitigate old conflicts. We're here because there's a genuine business opportunity on the table, and we came to you first because family. You came to me, I said, because you've already tried somewhere else. Or multiple somewheres. I watched his face. The Charlotte investors, have they actually signed a term sheet or is that still in conversation? Silence. Is there a term sheet? I asked again, gently. Broderick loosened slightly in his collar. It's a live discussion, so no term sheet. My sister-in-law's composure cracked the way expensive things crack, all at once, with a sharp edge. We came here in good faith, she said, her voice going tight. We came here because you clearly done well for yourself, and we thought maybe you'd want to be part of something again. Part of this family again. He was your husband, Vera. He was, I agreed, and when your mother told me at Christmas dinner that I'd never be right for this family, and when he sat there and didn't say a word, that was the moment I understood what I was actually part of. So I built something else. I stood up. Excuse me for just one moment. I walked out of the private dining room, through the frosted glass doors, into the quiet back corridor that ran behind the restaurant. I stood there for a moment in the dim hallway light, listening to the jazz through the wall. A slow, unhurried trumpet line that had been my favorite thing about this particular trio since I first booked them 2 years ago. Then I pulled out my phone and made a call. The person I called was not a lawyer, though I do have one of those on retainer and she is extraordinary. The person I called was my property manager, a methodical and meticulous man named Devereaux, who handles all lease and tenant matters across the 2 commercial properties I own in the Old Fourth Ward. Dev, I said when he picked up. I need you to pull the current lease status on the Fairfield Street storefront, the one with the wellness company. I already knew what he was going to tell me. I had known for about 3 weeks. Already have it up, he said, because Devereaux is the kind of person who always already has it up. Month to month since February. They missed the renewal window. You want me to prepare a notice? Not yet, I said. I'll call you back. I went back into the dining room. Here is something I had known for approximately 21 days and had not yet acted on, because I was deciding what to do. My ex-husband's company, a wellness tech startup that made an app for corporate mindfulness programs, which told you everything you needed to know about why it was struggling, had been subleasing office space from a company that itself leased one of my commercial storefronts on Fairfield Street. The chain was, I owned the building. A co-working company leased the ground floor from me, and my ex-husband's company subleased individual offices from them. I had found out through an entirely routine quarterly review of my tenant roster. His company name had appeared in a subleasing disclosure form that the co-working company was required to file with me. I had sat with that information for 3 weeks, trying to decide whether it was my business, whether to say something, whether to let it go entirely. Now his mother was sitting in my private dining room asking me for $300,000. I sat back down at the head of the table. I folded my hands the way she had folded hers when she started this conversation. "I have a question for you," I said, looking at my mother-in-law directly. "Does the name Fairfield Street mean anything to you?" She shook her head, cautious now in a way she hadn't been 20 minutes ago. "Your son's company has been subleasing office space on Fairfield Street," I said. "In a building I own." Broderick went very still. "I've known for 3 weeks," I continued. "I found out through routine paperwork. I hadn't decided what to do about it. But tonight you've come into my hotel and told me you need $300,000 to save his company. The same company, that is, as of February, operating month to month in a building I own. Which means I could issue a 60-day notice and remove them at any time without cause. And which means that the Charlotte investors, if they are real, will do standard due diligence and find out that his primary office address is held on an informal month-to-month arrangement with no long-term lease security." I paused. "That would tend to concern investors." The room was very quiet. My sister-in-law had gone the color of old chalk. Broderick's hands were flat on the table. My mother-in-law was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a woman who has just understood that she made a category error. "I'm not going to issue that notice," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to use this to hurt him. That's not who I am, and it's not how I run my business." She exhaled almost imperceptibly. "But I am also not going to give you $300,000, I said, or 15% of anything. And I'm going to tell you why, and I'd like you to actually hear it this time." I had spent years being too emotional in front of this woman, or too cold, or too defensive. I had spent years trying to find the register that would make her take me seriously, and I had never found it because the problem was not my register. The problem was that she had decided before I opened my mouth what I was worth, and no evidence to the contrary had ever been enough because she was not actually looking at the evidence. She was looking at the story she had already written. 7 years ago, I said. I was 24 years old, I had just been through a divorce that your family caused, and I had nothing, not because I had never worked for anything, but because everything I had was tied up in a marriage that your son and your influence dismantled, piece by piece. I started over with a savings account that had $4,000 in it, and a notebook full of plans that everyone around me thought were too big for someone like me to pull off. I glanced around the room, at the handmade ceramic light fixtures I had sourced from a woman in Savannah, at the linen curtains that had taken me 4 months to decide on, at the framed photograph above the credenza of the Caldwell House on opening night, taken by a photographer friend at 3 in the morning after the last guest checked in, and my staff and I sat on the lobby floor eating takeout. "I did pull them off," I said, "without your family's help. Without anyone's help, actually, except the people I hired and trusted and built something real with. And tonight, when you walked into my lobby and the first thing you said was that you needed a free suite, what I felt was not anger. I felt tired. Because it confirmed everything I had quietly hoped wasn't true. That the only reason you're here is because you need something, and the only reason you're framing it as family is because you think that word still has leverage with me." My mother-in-law opened her mouth. "I'm not finished," I said quietly. She closed it. "I don't know how his company got to where it is. I don't know if it's mismanagement or bad timing or just a hard market, and honestly that's not my concern. What I do know is that the way to fix it is not to drive to Atlanta and walk into your former daughter-in-law's hotel and demand a handout and call it family. That is not a business strategy. That is a desperation play. And I think somewhere underneath all the confidence you came in here with you know that too." She was looking at the table now. That was new. My sister-in-law's voice came out quieter than I expected. "We didn't know where else to go." It was the first honest thing anyone had said since they walked in. "I know," I said. And I did. I actually did. Not with pity. I was past pity. But with the particular clarity that comes from having been exactly that desperate yourself, from having sat on a studio apartment floor at 2 in the morning with a calculator and a legal pad and known that the numbers did not add up and had no one to call. Here's what I can do, I said. I can extend his sublease to a 12-month term at the current rate, locked in, which gives his company address stability for due diligence purposes. That buys time for the Charlotte deal or whatever comes next. I can have Devereaux draft that paperwork by Thursday. I watched something move through the room. That's it? Broderick asked. That's it, I said. I'm not an ATM and I'm not a family member. I'm a landlord who is offering a fair commercial arrangement to a tenant who needs stability. That's the appropriate relationship given everything that's happened, and I think we all know that. My mother-in-law looked up. Her eyes were different than they'd been when she came in. Not soft, exactly. I didn't think she had soft in her repertoire, but something had gone out of them, the performance of it. You could have just thrown us out, she said. It was not quite an acknowledgement. It was not quite an apology. It was the closest she was probably capable of in a single night. I thought about it, I said honestly. But this is my hotel. I don't want that energy in it. I stood up and this time I didn't say excuse me. I walked to the frosted glass doors and pulled them open. The sound of the jazz trio came through full and warm. They were deep into something with a long, slow build, the kind of song that makes you feel like you're in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Portia will see you out, I said. Safe drive back to Marietta. My sister-in-law stood first. She paused in the doorway for a moment, and I could see her working up to something, an apology or a dismissal or something in between. One of those things people say at the end of a confrontation that is meant to give them the last word without technically being unkind. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said nothing, which was probably the wisest decision she had made all evening. Broderick followed her, straightening his jacket, not making eye contact. My mother-in-law was last. She stood at the doorway with her fur coat back on. It was cooler in the hallway, and she looked at me one more time. I thought she might say something cutting. I thought she might reach for the register she had always been most comfortable in, the one where she had the power and I was the thing to be managed. Instead, she said, "You really did build something here." I held her gaze. "I know," I said. After they left, I stood in the empty private dining room for a few minutes. The water glasses were still on the table. The chairs were slightly askew. Through the wall, the trumpet was finishing its long note, and the room on the other side erupted into the kind of applause that sounds like genuine surprise. Like the audience didn't know the song was going somewhere that beautiful, and now that it had arrived, they couldn't believe they'd almost missed it. I thought about the card with the sunflower. I thought about the notebook it was taped into, which was now in a box in my office closet, under the finalized loan documents from my first SBA application, and a folded-up napkin from the night I signed the lease on this building, on which someone, I couldn't remember who, one of the contractors, had written, "Congratulations, boss." I thought about the version of myself who had received that card and read those words and felt what it felt like to have someone reduce you to a level, as if your life were something that could be permanently set. I thought about all the ways I could have handled tonight differently. I could have called security the moment they walked in. I could have said nothing, signed nothing, offered nothing. I could have let the month-to-month situation run out on its own and never told them I knew. There was a version of this night that was much louder and much more satisfying in the short term. A version where I showed them every document, every acquisition, every zero in my net worth, and watched their faces rearrange themselves around the reality of what I had become while they weren't looking. But I had learned, slowly, at some cost, that the most powerful thing is not always the loudest thing. The most powerful thing is having the choice and deciding, deliberately and without hurry, what to do with it. I fixed the chairs. I carried the glasses back out to the bar myself, because I was going to pass by anyway and it was on the way, and because there's nothing about owning a hotel that means you stop caring about the small things. Portia raised an eyebrow at me from the reception desk as I passed. "Everything okay, Vera?" she asked. "Everything's fine," I said. "How's the house?" "Full," she said. "There's a couple at table 7 who've been here since 6 and they just ordered dessert, so." She tilted her head in that way she had, which meant, they're not leaving anytime soon and honestly good for them. "Good," I said. I hung the glasses on the rack above the bar and dried my hands on a clean towel. "I'm gonna do a floor walk, and then I've got some paperwork for Dev in the morning. Remind me." "Already noted," said Portia. I walked out into the restaurant and moved through the room the way I always do at the end of a busy night. Slowly, without drawing attention, checking the water levels and the candle heights and the table spacing, listening to the quality of the noise, which in a good room has a particular texture like a full and comfortable river. At table 7, the couple Portia had mentioned were sharing a piece of olive oil cake and not talking, just sitting in the comfortable silence of two people who had been together long enough to not need to fill the space, and they looked so quietly content that for a moment I just stood near the window and let myself feel the thing I usually only feel in the small hours after closing, when the building is empty and still and entirely mine. I had built this. I had built every inch of it, out of years of night shifts and savings accounts and a notebook I kept next to my bed with ideas in it, and a card with a sunflower on it that told me to find my level, which I had. It was just a great deal higher than the person who sent it had in mind. 6 weeks later, the co-working company filed the amended sublease paperwork with Devereaux. The 12-month term was confirmed. The rate was fair. The address was stable. I never heard from my mother-in-law again. My ex-husband sent a short email through his company account, formal, not quite warm but genuine, that said the lease extension had made a real difference and thank you. I read it twice and then archived it and went back to the quarterly projections I had been reviewing before it came in. The Charlotte investors signed a term sheet the following month. I read about it in a regional business journal, 3 paragraphs in a roundup piece about Southeast startup activity. I was glad, in the abstract, unemotional way you can be glad about something that doesn't concern you anymore. The Caldwell House had its best revenue quarter on record that spring. We hired 2 new line cooks, expanded the rooftop terrace seating by 20%, and started a waiting list for private event bookings that ran 3 months out. On the last Friday in April, I opened the doors at 6 o'clock and stood in the lobby for a moment before the first guests came in, listening to the sound of my kitchen behind me and the warm air coming in off the street. And I thought about what it means to build something that is fully and completely yours. Something that no one can walk into and threaten, not because you have power over them, but because you are no longer afraid of what they think of you. When people ask me what finally made the difference, in the business, in my life, in the way I carry myself through a room, I always give the same answer, which is that I stopped waiting for people who had decided I would fail to change their minds. And I started spending that energy on the thing I was trying to build. The opinion of someone who has already decided your value is not data, it is noise. And you can spend your whole life trying to adjust the signal, or you can turn off that channel entirely and put on something worth listening to. I know which one I chose. If you've ever had someone tell you what level you belong at and then spent years proving them wrong without ever feeling like it was enough, I see you. Build the thing anyway. You don't need their revision of you. You just need the next step in front of you, and enough courage to take it. Subscribe if that story is yours too. I'll be right here. There is something nobody tells you about being underestimated by people who were supposed to love you. They don't tell you that it stays with you, not as an open wound, but as a low-frequency hum in the background of everything you build, every decision you make, every morning you get up before dawn and go back to the work. They don't tell you that for a long time you'll be building partly towards something and partly away from something, and that those two forces will feel almost identical until the day they finally separate. That Tuesday night in my hotel, when my mother-in-law walked through my front doors in a fur coat and led with a demand instead of a greeting, I understood something I had been circling for years. The cruelty people project onto you when you're young and vulnerable is rarely about you at all. It's about what you represent to them, the gap between who they believe they are and who they actually are. I was a threat to her story, not because of anything I had done, but because of what I might become. And she sensed it before I did. What she didn't understand, what people like her rarely understand, is that actions accumulate, not in a mystical way, not in a mystical way, not in any framework borrowed from religion or tradition, but in the plainest, most mechanical way imaginable. The choices you make determine the person you become. The person you become determines what you can build. What you build determines what you have standing when someone finally tries to take it from you. My mother-in-law made choices that year, about who mattered, about what words cost nothing, about whose future was worth protecting. Those choices accumulated, and so did mine. 7 years of them. $4,000 in a savings account and a notebook. And the kind of stubbornness that looks like stupidity until it doesn't. Broderick walked into my dining room with a pitch and left with nothing, because a pitch built on a false premise that I still needed their approval. That family was a word that could be aimed at me like a key, was never a real pitch. It was theater. And I'd stopped being a willing audience a long time ago. What I keep coming back to when I think about that night is the moment my sister-in-law said we didn't know where else to go. Because that was true. And the truth of it didn't move me toward pity the way it once might have. It moved me toward clarity. This is what happens when the architecture of your life is built on leverage over other people instead of something you actually made. When the leverage shifts, there's nothing underneath, no floor. My mother-in-law had spent decades managing relationships instead of building them, and when the management failed, she was left with a fur coat and an ask and a daughter-in-law who had, in the intervening years, become her son's landlord. I offered the lease extension not because I owed them anything. I offered it because I had decided, somewhere in those 7 years, that I didn't want to be someone who uses power carelessly just because they have it. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who expect a cleaner revenge story. The point was never to destroy them. The point was to be free of them. Genuinely free. Not the kind of free that still requires them to suffer so you can feel the distance. I didn't need to watch them fall. I just needed to stop falling with them. If you have ever been handed a version of yourself by someone else, a small, insufficient version, dressed up in their own fears and limitations and called truth, I want you to know that you are allowed to refuse it. You are allowed to put it down and build from what's actually in front of you. It will take longer than you think. It will cost more than feels fair. But the thing you build will be yours in a way that nothing handed to you ever could be. And when someone walks in one day and tries to take it, you will know exactly what you're standing on. That's worth more than any sunflower card.